Hey everybody, welcome back to my coverage of the PogChamps 3 tournament. This is the second championship quarterfinals match, Daniel Negreanu versus BenjyFishy. BenjyFishy is the small favorite. He came first in his group in the group stage compared to Daniel second in his group in the group stage. And BenjyFishy does have the slight rating edge. So he is the small favorite, but these players are close enough in skill that this match could go either way. So let's see how the players played. BenjyFishy has the white pieces and he starts with knight to f3. We have knight to f6 from Daniel mirroring, and now g3 from BenjyFishy. We have c5 from Daniel, going for sort of this reversed English setup, I guess is what you could call this. I don't really know. It kind of looks like a reversed English. We have bishop g2 and now d6 from Negreanu, and Negreanu is kind of going for this Sicilian setup. You know, we've seen him play this, you know, c6, d5, e6, knight f6, a6, b5, bishop b7, knight bd7 in pretty much all of his games. So we'll expect something similar in this game, and we'll see how that plays out. We have castles from BenjyFishy and knight c6 from Negreanu, d4 from Benji, and c cross d4, knight cross d4, and now we kind of have like some, we have this like Sicilian pawn exchange that often happens in the open Sicilian, except white hasn't pushed e4. But it's like an almost Sicilian position. But okay, we have queen d7 from Daniel, now just defending this knight as it was attacked twice. Queen c7 or queen b6 probably would have been better because now you're blocking this bishop, and queen c7 and queen b6 don't block that bishop. But queen d7 is, an okay move. And here BenjyFishy takes. We have knight takes c6, and this is probably not the best idea. In these types of positions where you have this c pawn exchange for white's d pawn in the Sicilian, and then knight recapture, you generally don't want to take black's knight on c3 here as white, because it allows black to take towards the center and basically just have a very strong and solid setup in the center. And so it's generally not advised to do that. And I think the same principle applies in this position. When you're taking here, first of all, you're trading your knight, which you've spent 2 tempo developing, for black's knight, which he has only spent 1 tempo developing. And, you're just giving black this nice pawn structure, which he can use to have a very nice center. So I wouldn't advise taking right there. I would just leave this tension here if I were Benji. But we do have this trade. We have c4 now from Benji and bishop b7, Daniel developing that bishop, and now knight to c3 from Benji. c5 now from Daniel, opening up this bishop and looking to trade the pair of bishops, and now knight d5, Benji blocks the diagonal. We have knight takes d5 and now c takes d5, and this blocks your own bishop's diagonal, but it also blocks black's bishop's diagonal. So this is a fine recapture with the pawn here. We have g6 now from Daniel, going for this double fianchettoed setup, and bishop f4 from Benji. One idea I saw here is that I think probably the setup, or the idea that I would have gone for, is bishop d2 to c3, because black obviously wants to put his bishop on this diagonal, and this b pawn will be weak if you develop this bishop, and you won't be able to move your b pawn because it will be pinned to your rook. So that's just like a very natural maneuver that I saw. You can move your bishop to d2, and if bishop g7, now you have bishop c3. One drawback of this maneuver, however, is that once this happens, black can now trade these bishops and play like bishop a6, and now black will have this good bishop because their pawns are on dark squares, and you'll have this pawn on a light square as white, and this pawn will be weak if you ever push it to c4. Now it's on a light square as well, and that's just making this bishop bad. If you want to support this pawn with e4, once again, that's making your bishop bad. So that is one drawback of this bishop d2 to c3 maneuver. But it seems very natural, and the drawback of not going for that is, like, once again, this diagonal will be weak. So we do have Benji play bishop f4, which is totally fine as well, and Daniel goes for bishop g7. Benji defends his b pawn with queen to d2, and now he also has some bishop h6 ideas of trading off Daniel's dark squared bishop. We have castles from Negreanu and now bishop h6 from Benjy. Both players, I just want to say, both players playing really fantastically so far. There haven't been any major mistakes at all, like no major positional mistakes. This knight takes c6 from Benjy earlier on was sort of a minor positional mistake, but no major positional mistakes and no missed tactics from either player so far. So they're both doing very well. Here we have f6 from Negreanu, and this move is kind of weird. I would have preferred a move like rook f to b8 because, well, first of all, you might be wondering why not bring the a rook to the b file, and the reason is simply none of these files are going to be opening up anytime soon. You could maybe bring your f rook to the c file and your a rook to the b file, but I think it's better to have your a rook stay on the a file and your f rook come to the b file, and then you can use it to support this pawn, as I think the a file has some chance of opening up, and then you'll have these two open files for your rook. And you may end up doubling up on the b file anyway, so it may not end up mattering too much. But we have this f6 move from Negreanu, which it's kind of weird, and I think it just weakens the squares around your king, so I don't think it's going to be too good in the long term, but Negreanu plays it. Benjy continues with his plan of bishop takes g7, eliminating that fianchetto bishop, and we have king takes g7. Rook f to e1 from Benjy, and rook f to e8 from Negreanu. I think Negreanu wants to strike in the center and eliminate this d pawn, so I think that's the reasoning behind him bringing this rook to e8. We have rook a to d1 from Benjy, and rook a to b8 now, Negreanu getting his rook on that half-open file. We have b3 from Benjy, stopping any c4 ideas, and also kind of just solidifying this pawn structure here in case you don't want your queen tied down to your b pawn in case this bishop ever moves. But so yeah, b3, totally fine move. And we have now e5 from Negreanu. And before you play this e5 move, you have to make sure that this en passant move is not going to be okay. And Negreanu actually was setting up this move with his previous moves of rook to e8 and rook to b8. It's important that this bishop is defended, and also that you can recapture with your rook to defend your d pawn enough times, as when this pawn captures, it will there will be a double attack unleashed on this d6 pawn from White's battery on the d file. So Negreanu definitely prepared this e5 move well enough, and now it's a totally fine move to make in this position. Though whether it was the best overall plan is debatable. Your king is going to be very exposed if you open things up in the center, so I think a better plan would have just to be to keep the center closed and try to gain some activity on the b file with doubling your rooks on the b file or something like that. But we have this e5, and Benjy definitely opens up the center, which I think is the right call, with d takes e6. Now also attacking this queen and hitting this bishop. So Daniel really only has one move here. He plays rook takes e6, now defending his d pawn. And we have e4 from Benjy. And this is a really sneaky move because it is setting up this bishop h3 discovery. And here it's kind of hard to defend this threat as black. One interesting way you can defend it is by playing rook b to e8. And you may be thinking, how does this stop bishop h3? Well, now if White plays bishop to h3, Black can play f5, and this blocks the skewer. But then if White plays e takes f5, now we can play rook takes e1, and after rook takes e1, we can play queen c6, threatening checkmate on h1. So White has to play a move like f3. Now we can trade the second pair of rooks, rook takes e1, queen takes e1, and now we can pick up this pawn on f3. And now White has to go for this perpetual check because their king is too weak, and I mean, it's just both kings are just very exposed here. So this is basically going to be a draw because if one side ever gets too far ahead, then we could see a perpetual from the other side. So here White could go for an immediate draw with queen e7 check, and if the king ever comes to h6, well, this is a perpetual just like this with the queen coming to h4. And if the king ever goes to g8, then we simply have queen e8 check, and Black can never escape these checks. And you never want to come to h8 with this king because then f8, queen to f8 would be immediately checkmate. So this is one interesting way to defend this bishop h3 threat as Black, and this would lead to a draw. which both players have played very well so far. Once again, not really any major mistakes from either player. So I think a draw would be a fair result. However, Negreanu plays bishop c6 instead. And you might be thinking, okay, well, what if bishop h3? Now what's the difference? Why can't we play f5? And the difference is now after bishop h3, now if black tries to go for f5, there's e takes f5, rook takes e1, and now rook takes e1. And now the queen is on d2, and we can't deflect the queen to e1 because we don't have a rook on e8. And also there's none of this checkmate threat because we've also put our bishop on c6. So now if black goes for something like g takes f5, well, black has saved the loss of the exchange, but now there's queen g5 check. And this is just a terrible position for black. Their king is extremely exposed, and after king f7 and bishop takes f5, black is actually totally lost here. So you know, just their king is just way too exposed, and nothing will work. White's attack will be too strong. So yeah, that's the difference why you can't really play f5 here. I don't know if Daniel missed he could play this f5 move, or if he saw that, you know, if he was worried about some e takes f5 type of stuff. But we do see him simply give up this rook, and now he plays rook b to e8, though it's one move too late. And BenjyFishy does definitely pick up this exchange with bishop takes e6, rook takes e6, and BenjyFishy is up the exchange. We have f3 now from Benji, and you really have to be careful about, you know, weakening your king now, because you are up the exchange, but queens are still on the board. So, you know, you don't want to be weakening your king, because you could give black the opportunity to, you know, get some perpetual checks or just some counterplay in general when you weaken your king like this. We have g5 from Negreanu, and now queen to c2 from Benji. King to f8. Negreanu said his reasoning behind this move was he wanted to get the king to a safer spot. But in my opinion, I think g7 is probably the safest place for the king right now. You know, it's blocked on the g file from this g pawn. It's blocked on the on this diagonal from this f6 pawn. It's defending everything very well. So I think g7 is probably one of the safest spots, if not the safest spot, for this black king on the board. But we have king f8 anyway, and this actually sort of works out for Daniel, because now BenjyFishy plays f4, and this is not what you want to do. Much better would have been g4, just closing down this king side, because now that you've advanced these pawns in front of your king, you want to try to keep things closed, and you can do this with g4, and this will kind of maximize your king safety. Obviously, you cannot move these pawns backwards, but if you can try to keep things closed, it will be much harder for black's pieces to attack your king. So g4 would have been much better, and f4 does the exact opposite of what you want to do. It now allows Daniel to open things up, and this will get some counterplay on your king, which is definitely not what you want as white. So Daniel does go for this. He plays g takes f4 and g takes f4, and now that his king is no longer on g7, he has the g file open for his queen, which Daniel definitely takes advantage of with queen g7 check. And here, as Benji, you just got to play queen g2. I mean, you may end up losing this e-pawn later on, but you know, you are happy with the queen trade here, as you are up the exchange, and your king is very exposed. So you want to get queens off the board here. But I guess Benji was afraid of losing this e-pawn after the queen exchange, so we have king to f2 instead. We have queen g4 from Negreanu, and now you can see the danger of not trading queens here. You know, this f pawn will fall. If you try to defend the f pawn, then the e pawn will fall, and black is getting a huge attack here, really. So Benji plays queen to d2 to try to defend the f pawn, but now we have bishop takes e4 from Negreanu, and here it's really difficult to defend as white. You can try king to f1, but here black is actually winning. The lines are pretty complicated, so I'm not going to show them all. But really, the safest and actually the best defense is actually to sacrifice your rook for this bishop, just to eliminate any, you know, queen g2 ideas, queen f3 ideas. And also, once black's rooks takes back, we can now take this d6 pawn with check. And black's king is also very exposed, so we could get some perpetual check ideas. And this is just generating counterplay of your own here as white. So this is definitely the best defense. Will Benji go for it? Yes, he does. He plays rook takes e4 after quite a bit of a think, And I was actually surprised when Benji played this move because I found that beginners are usually reluctant to sacrifice material, but especially when defending. But this was just a great defense by Benji, so congrats to him on that. We do have rook takes e4 from Negreanu, really the only move, and now queen takes d6 from Benji, king to g7, and queen d7 check. This forces the queen trade, so we have queen takes d7 and rook takes d7, and now we're going into a rook endgame in PogChamps with the prior game played. I mean, this was a really high quality game of chess, and now we're going into a rook endgame. I would have never expected this in a PogChamps game, but we have it. So first, D-Negs escapes this check with king to g6, and we have king to f3 from Benji now attacking this rook. We have rook to e1 and rook takes a7 from Benji, so now Benji is up a pawn, but maybe black can pick up this h-pawn or this f-pawn with their king. We have rook f1 check and king to g3, h5, and now a4, both players wanting to push their pawns in the endgame, especially this passed pawn on the a file. However, when you push this a2 to a4 move, you do now weaken your b3 pawn, and if you try to defend with rook to b7, now there's c4, and this pawn cannot take because it's pinned to the rook. And this is still a draw, but it definitely makes things complicated. So will we see this continuation? Well, Daniel does start with rook to b1, but Benji now simply gives up this pawn with rook to c7, or he doesn't give it up, but he decides to trade it for this c pawn. So will Daniel go for this trade? Well, it's not really a trade because after Daniel takes this b3 pawn, it is now check. So I think Benji must have missed this because now after king h4, Daniel can defend his pawn with rook to c3. And so now material is back to even. Both players have passed pawns on the queen side, and this will be an interesting endgame. We have a5 and rook to c4 from Daniel, a6, so you don't want to let that pawn go too far up the board. However, you also hang this f-pawn when you push a6, so maybe a better move here would have been to play king g3, and you can push this f-pawn, or this a-pawn later, excuse me. But we have a6, and now this drops another pawn for Benji, so now Daniel will be up one pawn, and yeah, this maybe was not the safest way to continue this endgame for Benji. Being down a pawn, now you have to worry about two passed pawns, and this is also check, so you can't even pick up the c pawn. We have king g3 and now rook to a4, counterattacking Benji's a pawn. We have a7 now defending, and c4. Daniel also defends his pawn. And here Benji plays a really fancy move, maybe not super fancy, but he finds this nice tactic, which is rook takes c4. And obviously you can't take this rook because white will promote. So this is basically forcing the trade of the two passed pawns. We have rook takes c4 and rook takes a7. And now Benji goes after the kingside pawns. We have rook to f4, rook to a3 check, king to h4. And by the way, this position is definitely a draw, but black obviously has the winning chances here. So we'll see if the players can hold a draw, or if black wins, or if Daniel blunders this away to Benji somehow. We have f5 and h3 now, rook to a5 and king to g3, rook e5 and now h4 from Benji, and here Daniel plays rook to e4, and this is basically inviting the draw. There may have been more testing ways to try to play for the win here as Daniel, but this is just a very simple draw after rook takes e4, f takes e4, and king to f4. And you don't have anything you can do here as black. You know, even if you play e3, white simply takes, and king to f5, there's just king to f3. Neither of these pawns can ever be captured, and even if one of them is somehow captured, it's a wing pawn, so just get your king to the corner, and there's nothing the other side can do. So this would have been a very simple draw from Benji, but Benji doesn't go for this. Maybe it was the time pressure. He does only have 24 seconds, as you can see here. But Benji plays king to f3, and now this is totally losing for Benji after rook takes f4 check. Maybe Benji didn't think this was losing because he saw that after king takes f4, the black king is behind the pawn. However, with these wing pawns, it changes everything, basically. And you'll see why here. So Daniel starts with king to f6, obviously really the only move. You have to stay connected to your pawn. And now we have king to g3, king to e5, and now king to f3, f4, and maybe Benji still thinks this is a draw since black's king is behind the pawn. We have king to f2 now and king to e4, king to g2. Grabbing the opposition definitely would have been more testing. But we have king to g2 and king to e3. And now the king is in front of the pawn, so this should definitely be a win for black. This would even be a win even if these pawns didn't exist now. We have king to g1, and once again, king to f1. Maybe, I mean, the king is already on, this black king is already on one of these three key squares, so it doesn't really matter too much what you do here as white. But we have king to g1 and now f3 from Daniel. We have king to f1. By the way, this simply king to e2, defending every square for this pawn to promote would have been the simplest win. But f3 is also winning because now after king to f1, however, now the quickest win is to play f2 and the king has to come to g3. White is in Zugzwang, and now black can play king to e2 and promote on the next move. However, Daniel did not go for this. He might have got a little scared. He went back to f4 with his king, and it's still winning for black. But, you know, we just have to repeat a little bit. We have king to f2 and king to g4. Here, you definitely want to stay connected to this pawn, so you would want to play king to e3. And that way, if black goes for this pawn, then we have king takes f3, and this is a draw now, actually. King to h3 and just king to f2. If the king tries to escape the h-file, then we simply come to h1, and black can never promote. If the king comes to h2, then we simply play king to f1, and once again we have the same deal. If the king escapes the h-file, we simply come to h1, and this is a draw. And if the king comes to h1, we simply go back to f2, and the king is stuck on the h-file. And obviously, black needs to escape the h-file first in order to promote their pawn. So this would have been one attempt to swindle a draw from Benji, but instead Benji plays king to f1. So this just gives the win to dnegs basically, because after king to h4, now black has two passed pawns, and so yeah, there's just nothing you can do here as white anymore. We have king to f2 and king to g4, king to e3 and king to g3, king e4 and h4 now from dnegs, king f5 and h3, king e4, h2, king f5, and Daniel makes a queen with h1 equals queen. We have king e4, f2, discovered check on the king, king f5, and f1 equals queen, so maybe Daniel will stalemate. We have king to e5 and queen h to f3, king d4, queen 3 to e2, king d5, queen f d1 check, and now we have a very nice ladder mate from Daniel. King c6, queen e c2 check, king b5, queen db1 check, king a5, and queen c a2, which is checkmate. So Daniel pulling out the win in the end, BenjyFish blundering that draw away after a very long and hard-fought game. Very nice game from both players. This is almost certainly the highest quality PogChamps game we've seen in the entire tournament, and for that reason, maybe my favorite game of the entire tournament so far. But with these stronger PogChamps competitors now playing each other in the championship bracket, maybe we will get even higher quality games later in the tournament. So first game goes to Daniel. Will BenjyFishy be able to draw the match and take us to a tiebreaker in game 2, or will Daniel shut out Benji and take the match and advance to the semifinals? Who knows? We'll just have to see. So I don't think I have anything else to say about this game or this match. So thank you for watching. I love you guys. Stay awesome. Keep it real, and I'll see you next time.